Hello everyone and welcome to my channel Y&R Trends. I hope everyone is having a wonderful day. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and give this video a thumbs up. Nick Newman had experienced his share of heartbreak, chaos, and blindsided twists in his life, but nothing could have prepared him for the call that came through late that evening, a call that stopped him cold in the middle of his living room, a call that made the air seem too thin to breathe, a call that delivered the kind of news every parent fears with every heartbeat. And as the familiar voice on the other end delivered Noah's bad news, Nick felt the world tilt beneath him, his heart hammering against his ribs as though demanding a different reality, a second chance, any opportunity to unhear what was already echoing in every cell of his body. For a moment everything around him, Sharon's framed photos on the fireplace mantel, Christian's small forgotten toys near the couch, the soft sound of wind brushing against the windows, became strangely distant, as if the universe itself paused to recognize the magnitude of what had been spoken. Nick's hand tightened around his phone as though afraid it might shatter in his grip, and he was barely aware of the sound of his own voice asking the caller to repeat it, to clarify, to reassure him that maybe he had misunderstood. But there was no misunderstanding, no alternative interpretation, no comfortable explanation, only the stark, crushing reality that Noah had been hurt, that something had gone terribly wrong, and that the situation was unfolding faster than anyone could fully grasp. This was not the kind of call that warned of a minor problem, not the kind where someone had been delayed or gotten a flat tire or missed a flight. This was the kind of call that altered the trajectory of families, legacies, futures, and lives, and deep down Nick felt the same surge of helpless panic that had consumed him the night Cassie died. The same terror he fought when Faith was gravely ill, the same gut-deep dread he had endured during the darkest chapters of his life. And for an instant, he almost buckled under the emotional weight. The voice on the phone continued speaking, details, complications, medical updates, instructions, but Nick's brain filtered none of it clearly, only fragments bleeding through the haze like shards of glass. Injury, emergency transport, critical condition, stabilization attempted. Family should come immediately. Nick heard those words and the world snapped sharply back into focus, every nerve in his body firing with singular purpose. But even as he moved, even as he grabbed his keys, even as he locked the door behind him and raced toward the hospital, something inside him was shattering, the protective shell that every parent carries to pretend their children are safe, that tragedies like this only happen to other people, other families, other mothers and fathers who get calls no one wants to receive. Nick had always tried to shield Noah, even when Noah was grown, even when Noah insisted on making his own way in the world, even when Noah assured him he didn't need constant supervision or rescue missions. But that instinct never faded, not for someone like Nick who loved fiercely and fought like hell for the people who mattered. The drive to the hospital became a blur of red lights, honking horns, screeching turns, and desperate half-formed prayers that tumbled through his head. Prayers he hadn't spoken so urgently since the early years when Faith lay in a hospital bed with tubes and monitors beeping in the glass-walled room. Everything about the emergency wing felt painfully familiar. The antiseptic smell, the fluorescent brightness, the rush of nurses and residents moving with practiced urgency, and for a moment Nick had to steady himself on the counter just to keep from collapsing under the tidal wave of déjà vu and fresh horror. When he finally managed to speak to a doctor, the information was clinical, efficient, and impossibly cold, because medical language had no space for the emotional carnage being unleashed inside him. Noah had been found unconscious, the result of a confrontation that had turned violent, an event that law enforcement was already parsing for suspects and viable leads, but none of that mattered to Nick, not right then. Not the how, not the who, not the police involvement, only the condition of his son, only whether Noah would wake up, would fight, would survive. Nick demanded to see him, and eventually he was led through a hallway that seemed far too silent until he reached the ICU room, and there, seeing his son, still pale, monitors humming, an oxygen tube under his nose, for lines taped against his wrist, Nick's heart clenched and his knees nearly gave out, because no matter how old Noah was, no matter how independent, no matter how grown, he would always be Nick's child, the little boy who once ran through the ranch laughing, the boy who painted with Sharon in the kitchen, the boy who fought to protect his little sisters, the boy who once crawled into Nick's lap after a nightmare and asked if everything would be okay. Nick stood beside the bed, his fingers brushing gently across Noah's hand, and memories surged of all the moments he had taken for granted, all the arguments that suddenly felt trivial, all the words unspoken that now demanded a future in which they could be said. He spoke to Noah even though Noah didn't respond, not yet at least, telling him to fight, telling him he loved him, telling him he was not alone, and even though his voice trembled and tears slipped down his face, Nick didn't wipe them away. He didn't care who saw or how vulnerable he looked, because at that moment nothing mattered except the hope that his son could still feel his presence. Sharon arrived minutes later, her eyes wide and wet, and when she saw Noah her hand flew to her mouth, her entire body shaking as if thunder had cracked through her bones, and Nick moved to her, holding her close even though it was clear they were both fractured in ways they could not yet articulate. The police had already begun forming a timeline of the incident, and the hints suggested that the attack on Noah was not random, that there were motives, grudges, and possibly someone in Genoa City who had waited for the right moment to strike. But the detectives knew that digging into the Newman's orbit could uncover a hornet's nest of rivalries, secrets, old resentments, and potentially dangerous truths. Hospital staff encouraged them to go home and rest, but neither Nick nor Sharon could even consider the idea, because sitting in those chairs, breathing the same air, listening to the slow, steady beep of the monitor was the only lifeline they had to Noah's survival. As the hours passed, more family filtered in. Victoria, pale with fury and fear, already mentally compiling a list of enemies. Nikki, trying to remain calm but visibly unraveling inside. Victor, cold-faced but murderous behind the eyes, already promising retribution. Even Adam appeared, unusually silent, his expression grim but not unsympathetic, as though the news had pulled the ground out from under him too. For once, all the Newman conflicts paused, every feud forced into silence by the gravity of Noah's condition, and it was impossible not to recognize how crisis had the power to strip away the armor and reveal the softest parts of the people who spent their lives trying to appear unbreakable. Nick alternated between shock, grief, anger, and adrenaline, pacing the hallway demanding updates, lashing out at automatic doors that opened too slowly and vending machines that took too long to release a bottle of water he wouldn't end up drinking. And more than once Sharon had to take his hands and remind him to breathe, to stay grounded, to focus on Noah and not on the phantom enemies in his mind. But Nick couldn't help it. Not when the one thought that kept pounding through him was that someone had done this, someone had targeted his son, someone had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed, and Nick Newman was not going to let that stand. He had made mistakes, he had made enemies, but he had never been the type of man who let his family suffer without demanding answers. When the surgeon finally returned to give another update, everyone held their breath, the waiting room silent except for the rustle of clothing as people stood, their faces tense with dread. Noah had come through a risky procedure but was still in critical condition. Swelling needed to reduce, brain activity needed to stabilize, and the next 24 hours were crucial. It was not the comfort they needed, but it was not hopeless either, and that sliver of possibility became the thread Nick clung to, the thin rope holding him above the abyss. As the night turned into a numb, sleepless dawn, Nick found himself sitting beside Noah again, talking quietly about memories. Times at the ranch, baseball games in the backyard, late-night talks at the coffee house, hoping that familiarity, that love, that warmth could somehow reach the parts of Noah fighting in the dark. He promised his son that no matter who had done this, they would be found, and in that vow was the unspoken truth. Genoa City was about to tremble under the force of Nick Newman's determination. He had been passive once, he had trusted the system once, he had believed in letting the truth surface in its own time, but those days were gone, and anyone who had taken aim at his child was about to learn what it meant to provoke a father who had already buried a daughter once and would do anything to prevent history from repeating itself. Whatever crimes, secrets, conspiracies, or vendettas lay beneath the surface, they would be exposed. Whoever had laid a hand on Noah had invited a war. And Nick, shattered but still standing, was ready. The tension in the hospital waiting area grew heavier with every passing hour, and as the sun slowly climbed higher over Genoa City, Nick found himself running on caffeine, adrenaline, and sheer terror while refusing to leave Noah's bedside for more than a few minutes at a time, afraid that if he stepped away, even for the smallest instant, he might miss the moment his son woke up, or worse, the moment when doctors rushed in because things had taken a turn for the worse, and the not knowing was torture in a way Nick had rarely experienced so intensely. Sharon sat silently in one of the room's chairs, her face pale but her posture rigid, because every fiber of her being was fighting not to collapse, and when she occasionally reached out to rest her hand on Noah's arm, her eyes shimmered with the same unspoken fear Nick felt, the fear that their boy might slip away before they could even hear him speak again. Nurses in the ICU moved cautiously, exchanging sympathetic glances with Nick and Sharon, because they recognized the Newman name, they recognized the weight of a family's crisis, and they recognized the look of a mother and father who had already lived through one nightmare in the past, and were desperately hoping this time the ending would be different. Nick could almost hear ghosts whispering behind him, the memory of Cassie in her hospital bed, her small broken body trying to hold on to life while doctors whispered words like internal bleeding and no guarantees. And though Nick didn't believe trauma ever fully healed, he realized in this moment just how deeply that old wound had scarred him. Losing one child was a wound that reshaped a parent's world forever, and the idea of losing another was almost more than he could process. Victor returned after a brief but intense conversation with hospital administration and law enforcement, the kind that ended with sharp nods and hushed tones, because Victor wasn't just any worried grandfather. He was a man who built empires, moved chess pieces faster than most people could blink, and was already mobilizing every resource he had to identify who was responsible for putting Noah in this bed. Although Victor's protective anger simmered beneath his calm exterior, Nick didn't need to ask what his father was planning. Victor Newman only had one response when someone attacked his family: retribution, swift and absolute. Yet for all his determination, even Victor could not stop the way his expression softened, just barely, when he placed a hand on Noah's shoulder and whispered something too low for anyone else to hear, a moment that reminded Nick that his father, beneath all the ruthlessness, was also a grandfather terrified of losing a boy who carried not just Newman blood but also hope for the future. Nikki, ever the quiet emotional center of the family despite her own flaws and battles, positioned herself beside Sharon, offering comfort wherever she could, rubbing her shoulders, speaking softly, whispering prayers under her breath, and even Victor seemed to draw quiet strength from her presence, though he never admitted such things out loud. Adam stood near the doorway, arms crossed, his face unreadable, and Nick watched him for a moment, unsure whether his half-brother was battling guilt, fear, or some internal calculation about what this crisis meant for the Newman name. But Nick also knew that despite all their complicated history, Adam cared about Noah. Maybe not in the same way Nick did, but enough that the gravity of the situation weighed visibly in the tension of Adam's jaw. When the doctor returned again with new updates, Nick felt his heart leap into his throat, every muscle in his body tightening in preparation for either salvation or devastation, and the doctor's words came slowly, deliberately, as though he understood that every syllable mattered. Noah's brain activity was showing slight improvement, but his vitals remained unstable, and though the next several hours were still critical, the medical team was cautiously optimistic. It wasn't the miracle Nick wanted, but it was a spark of hope nonetheless, and that spark was enough to keep him upright, enough to keep him believing that maybe, just maybe, his son might still pull through. Sharon bowed her head into her hands and began to cry silently, her shoulders shaking, and Nick slipped into the chair beside her, taking her hand as they sat together in quiet grief, relief, terror, and exhausted hope, emotions that only parents in such impossible circumstances truly understood. But while the medical world focused on stabilizing Noah, the outside world, the world of secrets, agendas, and rivalries, was already spinning into motion as police detectives began piecing together what had happened in the hours leading to Noah's attack. According to early reports, Noah had been found after what appeared to be a targeted confrontation, not a random street incident, and that detail alone set off alarms for everyone who understood the factional currents beneath Genoa City's business and personal histories. Victoria immediately began mentally cataloging business adversaries with grudges, rivals with wounded pride, and opportunists who might see the Newmans as vulnerable, but Adam had an entirely different perspective, one that made Nick's stomach twist uncomfortably. This attack might not have been about Victor or the Newman brand or corporate warfare. It might have been about something in Noah's personal life. Noah wasn't a child anymore. He had romantic entanglements, artistic projects, overseas business connections, and more than one situation that could have made him a target. Nick rubbed his temples, trying to remember every conversation he'd had with Noah in recent weeks, every sign that something might have been wrong, but hindsight was a cruel mirror, one that only reflected what parents wished they'd seen sooner. Had Noah seemed tense the last time they spoke? Was there something behind his smile that Nick had brushed off as exhaustion? Was there something he had planned to confide but never got the chance? Nick's mind churned with questions and self-recrimination, because no matter how grown a child becomes, a parent's instinct is always to blame themselves for not protecting them better, and Nick was no exception. Sharon, too, was replaying conversations, reviewing choices, digging through her memories for anything she might have missed, and the guilt etched into her expression told Nick that she was fighting her own nightmares, because Sharon had lived through losing a daughter once, and she had barely survived the emotional fallout, and now she was standing on the precipice of that possibility again. Hours ticked by, each minute a lifetime, and eventually the hospital's hallway, once bustling, grew quieter as more of the staff shifted rotations, but none of the Newmans left, not even Adam, who eventually found himself leaning against the window staring out at the parking lot below, hands in his pockets, battling thoughts he kept buried behind his carefully constructed emotional barricades. At one point, he crossed the room and stood beside Nick, not speaking, simply present, and though Nick didn't turn to acknowledge him, that moment, wordless, tense, complicated, was its own expression of solidarity, a reminder that even fractured brothers could stand united when the stakes were high enough. Meanwhile, Victor had left to make a phone call, one that would likely initiate a private investigation parallel to the official police inquiry, because Victor understood better than anyone that not all truths surface through legal channels, and sometimes justice required leverage, pressure, or quiet persuasion in the places traditional law enforcement had no jurisdiction. When he returned, Victor's expression was darker, more controlled, the look of a man who had already set wheels turning, unofficial wheels that would dig deeper, ask harder questions, and refuse to be deterred by bureaucracy. And though Nick didn't agree with every method Victor employed, this time he wasn't going to interfere, because if Victor wanted war, Nick was prepared to pick up a weapon beside him. The hours passed, oxygen machines hummed, monitors continued their rhythmic beeping, and Nick drifted between hope and despair until a sudden memory surfaced. Noah as a small boy, sitting on the porch steps at the ranch asking if grown-ups ever got scared. And Nick had told him yes, everyone did, even fathers. But he hadn't told him the truth, not then, that the greatest fear wasn't about yourself but about the people you loved most, especially your children. And now, sitting in the ICU room decades later, Nick finally understood that fear in its rawest form. As the day stretched into its second evening, more Newman allies arrived, Summer with tears streaming down her face, Cal placing a reassuring hand on her back, Faith calling repeatedly for updates even though she was hours away, and even Noah's friends from the art community gathered outside the hospital in a small show of support. Word spread quickly in Genoa City, because Newman stories always did, and sympathy messages began pouring in, though Nick barely glanced at his phone, unable to handle the emotional overload of responding when his brain could process only one thing: the rise and fall of Noah's chest under the white hospital sheet. Eventually, Sharon encouraged Nick to step outside and breathe fresh air, and though he resisted, afraid to leave Noah even for a moment, he finally relented, stepping outside into the cold night, drawing in deep breaths as though the air itself might steady him. He stood there staring at the sky, trying to make sense of a world where someone would deliberately harm his son. And it was in that moment that Adam joined him, leaning on the railing beside him, silence stretched between them like a rope pulled too tightly. After several long seconds, Adam finally spoke, not with sarcasm or cynicism, but with a quiet sincerity Nick rarely heard from him, telling Nick that whatever his faults, whatever mistakes he had made, Noah didn't deserve this, and that he hoped sincerely Noah would fight his way back. Nick said nothing at first because he didn't trust himself to speak without breaking apart. But eventually he nodded, acknowledging not just Adam's words but the fact that for once, even Adam wasn't thinking about rivalry or position or validation. He was simply family. When they returned to the ICU, the doctor greeted them with new results. Noah had begun responding slightly to neurological stimuli, an encouraging sign that suggested he was fighting harder than anyone had feared. And Sharon burst into tears again, this time with relief rather than despair. But even with progress there was still danger, still uncertainty, still unanswered questions, and that was when the detective arrived, notebook in hand, ready to discuss the emerging leads in the investigation. Nick and Sharon exchanged glances, their dread returning, because it was one thing to endure the emotional torture of watching their son struggle for his life. Another thing entirely to confront the reality that this was not an accident, not a coincidence but an attack with intent. The detective began outlining what they knew. Witnesses had heard raised voices shortly before Noah was discovered, surveillance footage showed unknown figures near the location, and early statements suggested there may have been someone Noah had arranged to meet shortly before the confrontation. Nick's stomach tightened, because that meant Noah had walked into something, voluntarily or unknowingly, and the implications were terrifying. Sharon demanded names, suspects, anything, But the detective explained that they were still sorting credible information from gossip, and that until they had stronger evidence, speculation could jeopardize the investigation. Nick understood the logic, but logic meant nothing to a father whose son lay unconscious in a hospital bed, and he barely restrained the urge to demand faster results, angrier pressure, harder tactics. But Victor placed a hand on Nick's shoulder, silently signaling that whatever answers came through official channels might be slower than what Victor's alternatives could provide. As night once again settled around the hospital, and the lights outside blurred with the reflection of emergency vehicles and passing cars, Nick sat beside Noah, his fingers wrapped around his son's hand, whispering words of strength, stubborn hope, and unwavering love, because as long as Noah was fighting, Nick would be there, every second, every breath, every heartbeat, and whatever storm was coming next, whatever names, faces, secrets, or revelations the investigation unearthed, Nick Newman was ready to face it without hesitation, because no one, absolutely no one, hurt his child and walked away untouched.